It was just after 6 a.m., and the morning felt unusually still. The sky hung low with heavy gray clouds, and the mist left over from the early rain clung to the ground like a quiet warning. Traffic was light on Route 51, and the cold air carried the damp scent of wet grass and asphalt. Everything about that stretch of road felt like a pause, as if the world was holding its breath. In the grassy median between both lanes, for small shapes hung motionless against a metal utility pole. For German Shepherd puppies, no more than 8 weeks old, were tied up by thick cords, suspended just enough to keep their paws barely touching the ground. Their fur was soaked, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Not a single box or blanket nearby. No note, just the raw, heartless cruelty of being left behind like trash. Car after car drove past. A few drivers slowed down. Most didn't. Some may have seen the pups and looked away. Others might have felt the sting in their chest, but they kept driving. The world was busy, indifferent, but those puppies couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't cry anymore. One of them, the smallest, tried to bark, but only a weak, broken gasp came out. Officer Daniel Rourke was on his usual morning patrol route. A 53-year-old police veteran with a calm voice and quiet eyes. He drove the same stretch of road he had for nearly 2 decades. His life had been reduced to routine and silence since his wife passed away 5 years ago. He lived alone in a small house with creaky floors, a dusty record player, and an old wooden chair that still had her sweater draped over the back. But that morning, something made him slow down. A flicker of movement, a shape that didn't belong. As his headlights cut through the fog, he saw them, the 4 pups, still damp and bound to the pole. He hit the brakes and stepped out fast, his gut twisting the second he got closer. No hesitation. He drew the utility knife from his belt and began cutting the ropes, carefully. The pups didn't fight. They didn't even flinch. One by one, they dropped gently to the grass. The last one, with a crooked front paw, licked his hand before collapsing against his boot. As he laid them gently on the back seat of his patrol car, a memory slammed into him, vivid and unwelcome. A boy, a front yard, and a father walking away with a dog under his arm. That boy had been him. That dog had never come back. And now, decades later, here he was, staring into the same helpless eyes. Only this time he had the power to do something. He shut the door, turned the key, and drove toward the county shelter, unaware that what started as a routine patrol was about to unravel something buried deep in both the world around him and within himself. The county shelter sat on the edge of town, tucked behind an old water tower and surrounded by chain-link fences that had seen better days. It wasn't much, just a couple of converted trailers, some worn-out kennels, and a front desk staffed by volunteers and underpaid workers trying to do their best with almost nothing. As Officer Rourke pulled into the gravel lot, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds. The light hit the windshield just right, and for a second he had to pause. Something about this moment didn't feel routine. It felt personal. He stepped out slowly, opened the back door of the cruiser, and looked down at the 4 little lives he had rescued. They were huddled together, eyes blinking up at him like he was something between a ghost and a second chance. One of them, the one with the small white mark on his nose, tried to stand and let out a tiny whimper. That was the first sound any of them had made since he found them. Rourke felt that sound hit somewhere deep in his chest. It wasn't just a cry. It was a memory being rewritten. Inside the shelter, Tina Morales, the manager, met him with a puzzled look. She was in her late 40s, sharp but kind, and had been working with abandoned animals long enough to have built a wall around her heart. A wall that cracked a little every time a dog came in with eyes like these. As Rourke carried them in, Tina froze. "Where did you find them?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. He told her. The pole, the cords, the silence. Whoever did this, they knew what they were doing, she said, crouching beside one of the pups, examining the rope marks around his chest. These aren't backyard mistakes. This feels like someone trained them and then tossed them away when they weren't useful anymore. Her words lingered in the air. Canine lineage, maybe? It wasn't uncommon for breeders or handlers to dump dogs they considered defective. Rourke had heard the stories, but seeing it touching it. That was different. Tina began cleaning them up, one by one, and asked if he wanted to help name them. At first, he hesitated, but something about it felt necessary, like naming them would give them back a piece of their stolen identity. He pointed to the smallest, the one with the crooked paw. That's Scout. The one with the white mark became Buddy. The quietest of them, always watching, he called Shadow. And the fourth, the only one who had made eye contact the whole ride, he named Ranger. With each name, something softened in him. A wall he didn't know he still had. As Tina filled out the intake forms, she paused and looked at him. You know, sometimes dogs like these don't end up here by accident. Rourke didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. There was a knot in his gut, the kind that didn't come from guilt but from recognition. He couldn't explain it yet, but something about this case felt off. Not just cruel, planned, precise, familiar, and deep down, part of him knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The rest of Officer Rourke's day moved on like a ghost passing through familiar walls. He filled out his report, returned to his patrol duties, and tried to settle back into routine. But the images of those puppies wouldn't leave him. Every time he blinked, he saw their eyes. Every time the radio went silent, he heard that tiny whimper. Something had been awakened. Not just a memory, but a sense of unfinished business he couldn't shake. That evening, he drove back to the shelter. Not because he had to, but because he needed to. Tina was still there, cleaning up the main room, and when she saw him walk through the door, she didn't look surprised. "They've been sleeping most of the day," she said. "But every time someone walks past the door, they all look up, like they're waiting for someone to come back." Rourke didn't say anything. He walked over to the small crate where the 4 pups were resting. Scout opened his eyes first, then Ranger. He crouched beside them, reaching a hand into the crate. Shadow crept forward and gently placed his paw over Rourke's fingers. The officer froze. There was something deliberate in that movement, not just instinct, but trust. "That's not normal," Tina whispered behind him. "They were trained. These pups. They're not just anyone's. Someone spent time teaching them obedience. Watch how they sit when you raise your hand." Rourke tested it, slowly lifting his palm, and all 4 pups straightened their backs in sync. His mind clicked. A year ago, there was a case involving a private K-9 training facility just outside the county line Silver Ridge Tactical Canines. The owner, a man named Bennett Cole, had been under quiet investigation for abuse, mismanagement, and unlicensed breeding practices. The case never went anywhere. No formal charges, no media attention. Just whispers. Rourke had only heard bits and pieces through the grapevine. But now those whispers had a face. 4 of them, actually. He went home that night and pulled out his old notebook, the one he hadn't touched since before his wife died. It was filled with names, phone numbers, loose leads from old cases that had never quite sat right with him. He flipped through until he found a sketch of a map he had drawn long ago, marking out old properties connected to dog handling operations. Silver Ridge was on there. He hadn't looked at it in years. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his chair, Scout curled up at his feet after he couldn't stand to leave him at the shelter. And as the silence of the house wrapped around him, something clicked again. This wasn't just about abandoned puppies. This was about someone cleaning up a mistake. Quietly, cruelly, deliberately, and whether he liked it or not, he had just been pulled into something much darker than a roadside rescue. The next morning, Rourke didn't clock in at the station. Instead, he called in a personal day, the first one in nearly a year. He didn't offer a reason, and no one asked. He wasn't the type of man people questioned. By 7:30, he was already halfway down a cracked 2-lane road, the kind that didn't show up on GPS Scout rode in the passenger seat, ears twitching at every bump. Rourke had never broken protocol before, but something inside him whispered that waiting would only let whoever did this get further away. Silver Ridge Tactical Canines sat behind a set of rusted iron gates about 20 miles outside of town. The sign had been painted over, but the outline of the old logo, a German shepherd's head surrounded by a badge, was still faintly visible. The place looked abandoned at first glance, but Rourke knew better. There was a chain on the front gate, freshly locked, and a trail of tire tracks in the dirt, too recent to ignore. He parked off the road and walked the rest of the way. Scout followed. As they approached the property, something shifted in the air. Not a sound, but a feeling. Rourke used to call it cop instinct, that invisible thread that tugged at your spine when something wasn't right. The buildings were still intact. A long metal training shed, 2 mobile office units, and what looked like a kennel structure in the back. There was no barking, no movement, just silence. He found an opening in the back fence, just wide enough to slip through. Scout hesitated, then followed. The training shed's door creaked open with a push, revealing stacks of broken crates, chewed-up leashes, and a clipboard left behind on a workbench. Rourke scanned the papers, feeding schedules, breed notes, training logs, all dated within the last 2 weeks. So the place wasn't shut down. It had just disappeared from the public eye. That made his stomach turn. Then he heard something. Not loud, just a soft thump, like a door closing in the distance. He froze, listened. Nothing. But it was enough. He grabbed his phone, took a few pictures, and slipped back out, heart pounding. This wasn't a casual visit anymore. This was trespassing on what now looked like an illegal operation in hiding. If he was caught, he couldn't use his badge to explain why he was there. Not without putting everything and everyone at risk. Back at home, he sat with the photos laid out across his kitchen table. The last one, zoomed in on the kennel schedule, had something that made his blood run cold. 4 names, handwritten in red ink. Ranger, Shadow, Scout, Buddy. All listed under discard, non-compliant. Rourke leaned back in his chair, the breath knocked out of him. They had been marked for disposal. Not because they were weak, but because they wouldn't follow a command. And now, someone had tried to erase that evidence. But he had seen it. He had them. And whether he liked it or not, he had just become part of a story someone was desperate to bury. That night, Rourke sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, staring at the 4 names written in red ink. Discard, non-compliant. The words haunted him. His gut told him this wasn't just about dogs. This was about control, obedience, and punishment for those who failed to comply. Living beings discarded like broken equipment. He thought of how Scout had reached for his hand, how Ranger had stared back at him in the mirror. These weren't failed dogs. They were survivors. He reached for his notebook again. Not the one with old cases, the one he hadn't opened in nearly 30 years. It was from his academy days, filled with scribbled notes, old photos, and a letter he'd never mailed. It had been addressed to Bennett Cole. The name came alive now in a way that chilled him. Cole had been an instructor at the academy in the early 90s. Back then, Rourke had admired him, a K9 handler with unmatched discipline and results. But there had been whispers, even then, rumors about his methods, about what happened to the dogs that didn't make the cut. He flipped through the yellowed pages until he found a photo, grainy and worn. It showed a younger Rourke, standing stiffly beside a German shepherd named Rex. And next to them, with his hand gripping the dog's collar too tightly, was Bennett Cole. Rourke stared at the photo for a long time. It wasn't just professional history, it was personal. Rex had been his first K9 partner, and he had disappeared one day without warning. Transferred, they told him, but now he wondered if that had been a lie. As the pieces began to fall into place, a quiet rage started building in his chest. If Cole was behind Silver Ridge, if he had kept operating under different names outside the system, then how many dogs had vanished over the years? How many had been labeled non-compliant and left to die? And why were the 4 he rescued the only ones who got out? He picked up the phone and dialed an old contact from the academy, someone he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The call rang twice before a voice answered. Rourke, it's been a long time. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need everything you've got on Bennett Cole, and I need it now. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm his fear. You're not the first to ask, the voice said quietly. But every time someone digs into Cole, things disappear. Rourke hung up and looked over at Scout, who had curled up at the base of the stairs. The little pup raised his head, alert, watching his every move. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about redemption. For Rex, for those 4 pups, and for himself. Whatever was coming next, Rourke knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The following day, Rourke showed up at the precinct, but not in uniform. He walked in with a manila folder under one arm and Scout trotting quietly beside him. A few heads turned, not because of the dog, but because Rourke was rarely seen out of regulation. He went straight to the records room and requested archived reports tied to abandoned dogs, illegal kennels, and K-9 unit transfers from the past 15 years. The clerk raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Rourke had earned that kind of silent respect over the years. Back at home, he spread the documents across the dining table. It was worse than he imagined. Reports that were oddly incomplete. Witness statements without signatures. Files closed without explanation. The pattern was there if you looked hard enough. A trail of problem dogs removed from the system without consequence. One name showed up more than once in the background, never official, never central, but always close enough to raise suspicion. Bennett Cole. Then came the final blow. One report from 11 years ago mentioned a German shepherd named Rex, flagged as aggressive and removed from duty. The transfer location was blank. Rourke stared at the file, his heart pounding. They lied to me. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest. Rex being loaded into a van, Rourke told to stay behind due to protocol. That had been the last time he saw his partner. Now he knew. Rex hadn't been relocated. He'd been discarded, or worse. Fueled by anger and purpose, Rourke returned to Silver Ridge that night, this time with a flashlight, gloves, and his old badge tucked into his coat just in case things went sideways. The gate was still chained, but he knew another way in. Inside, the darkness felt heavier than before. The main shed had been cleaned, too clean. Fresh bleach stung his nose. Someone had come back. Someone who knew he was there the first time. He moved through the building with practiced silence until something stopped him cold. A hidden door behind a false wall in the training room. It wasn't much, just plywood and nails. But behind it was a small, soundproofed space lined with wire cages. Some were empty, some weren't. Bones, tags, chewed collars. One of them still had a nameplate, Rex Unit 739. Rourke's knees buckled. He knelt beside it, running a hand across the cold metal, his chest tightening. It was confirmation and closure, wrapped in heartbreak. He took pictures, all of it. As he stepped outside, headlights flashed in the distance. Someone else was coming. He ducked behind the shed, heart racing, body tense. A truck rolled in slowly, and a man stepped out. Tall, stiff, confident. Rourke didn't need light to recognize the way he moved. Bennett Cole. After all these years, the ghost had a face again, and he had just returned to the scene he thought no one had found. But this time, someone was watching. From behind the shed, Rourke kept his breathing slow and steady, his hand resting near his holster, though he hadn't drawn a weapon in years. He watched as Bennett Cole stepped out of the truck, wearing a dark jacket and work gloves. Cole moved with the casual confidence of a man who believed no one was watching. He carried a flashlight in one hand, and in the other, a large trash bag. Rourke's jaw clenched. Whatever was in that bag, it wasn't garbage. Not to him. Cole entered the training shed, flipping on a single bulb overhead. Rourke crept closer, careful with every step. Through a crack in the wall, he could see Cole walk straight to the hidden compartment. Rourke had left it open on purpose. A trap. Cole stared at the open plywood, and for a brief moment, his posture faltered, just enough to confirm what Rourke already knew. He thought it was buried for good. That guilt, that secret room, it was never meant to be found. Suddenly, Cole spun around, pulling a pistol from under his jacket. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice deeper, more brittle than Rourke remembered. Rourke didn't move, didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick as concrete. He waited until Cole turned his back again, then stepped into the light. "You always were sloppy with your endings," Rourke said, voice calm but sharp. Cole froze. For a second, he didn't even turn, just stood there, shoulders tight. Then slowly, he faced him. His eyes narrowed. Rourke, I should have known. The air between them was electric, full of history, failure, and unfinished consequences. You lied to me, Rourke said. About Rex. About all of them. Cole shrugged. They were assets. Some broke. Some didn't. You don't keep broken tools in a working box. The words were cold, mechanical. That was the difference between them. Rourke saw souls and Cole saw parts. Disposable ones. You tied up 4 puppies on the side of the road like garbage, Rourke said. Was that your version of mercy? Cole laughed bitterly. No, that was cleanup. One of my trainees panicked. Thought they might draw attention. He didn't have the stomach to put them down, so he dumped them. I went back to handle it, but you got there first. Rourke stepped forward, fury burning in his gut. They're alive, and they're not done fighting. Neither am I. Cole raised his gun halfway. You don't want to do this. But Rourke didn't flinch. No, he said. You don't. In that moment, something shifted. Cole saw it. In Rourke's eyes, the grief, the guilt, the weight of everything he'd lost, and he hesitated. Just long enough for Rourke to grab his arm and slam him against the wall, disarming him with a single practiced move. The gun clattered to the floor. Cole gasped for air, pinned under the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. Rourke didn't arrest him right away. He stood there, breathing hard, memories of Rex, of Scout, of every discarded life running through his mind. You're going to answer for every one of them, he said. Then, finally, he pulled out his phone and called it in. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a cop again, not by uniform but by conviction. The sound of sirens in the distance was the only answer he needed. The sirens arrived like a final punctuation mark. Red and blue lights painted the trees, the gravel, and the old metal structures of Silver Ridge in a pulsing rhythm that made the place feel even more ghostly. Cole sat on the ground, handcuffed and quiet, the bravado drained from his face. Officer Rourke stood nearby, arms crossed, watching as younger officers processed the scene he'd uncovered. They were respectful, silent. They knew what this meant to him. Detective Sarah Whitmore, from County Investigations, approached him with a folder under her arm and cautious eyes. "This is big," she said softly. "We've been circling Cole for years. We just never had physical evidence." Rourke nodded, barely speaking. "It was never about finding proof," he muttered. "It was about someone finally choosing to look." She paused for a second, then added, "You didn't just uncover a crime scene. You cracked open a system." By dawn, news vans had gathered at the property line. Cameras tried to zoom through the fence. Microphones chased uniforms, but Rourke said nothing to them. He wasn't interested in headlines or glory. He gave his full statement to the detective, handed over every photo, and requested one thing: that the 4 puppies be transferred to a safe, long-term foster program. "Not a shelter," he said. "A home." Later that morning, back at his house, Rourke sat on the porch with Scout curled up at his feet again. The old wood creaked under the shifting weight of time. He reached down, absent-mindedly scratching behind Scout's ear. "You know," he whispered, "you saved me more than I saved you." The little dog leaned into his leg, warm and trusting. And in that quiet moment, Rourke felt something loosen inside him. The decades of duty, loss, silence, finally starting to release their grip. A letter arrived 2 days later, typed, formal, and stamped with the seal of the State K-9 Commission. They were reopening multiple cases, including one with the designation Unit 739, Rex. The file was being reinstated as part of an internal review. It wasn't justice, but it was a beginning, and beginnings, Rourke had learned, were often disguised as endings. Tina Morales called him that evening. "I thought you might want to know," she said. "A woman came in today asking about adopting one of the 4. Said her late husband had been a handler. She picked Shadow. Said she didn't need a guard dog, just a companion who understood grief." Rourke smiled quietly. "They're good at that," he said. In the following weeks, Ranger and Buddy found homes too, each one carefully screened, personally visited by Rourke himself. Scout, however, never left. He became part of the house, the yard, the routine. He followed Rourke from room to room like a second heartbeat. Some things you don't let go of, not because they can't survive without you, but because you finally realize you can't survive without them. And yet, even as peace settled in, Rourke knew one thing for sure. The damage Cole had done would echo for a long time. But for once, the silence that followed wasn't full of regret. It was full of meaning. Spring came early that year. The air softened, and the bare trees along Rourke Street began to bloom with cautious green. Life, slow and quiet, was returning. Most mornings, he'd wake before the sun and take Scout for long walks through the edge of town. Through empty parks, by the water, down roads where memories still lingered like fog. He rarely spoke during those walks, but Scout didn't need words. He just stayed close, step for step. The town had changed in small ways since the Silver Ridge raid. People talked more openly now about cruelty, about corruption, about how silence helps the wrong things survive. The shelter had received new funding. A small plaque had been added outside its entrance. In honor of the lives rescued and remembered, Tina had insisted on it. She said it wasn't about the dogs. It was about what they represented and who they revealed us to be. Rourke had been invited to speak at the dedication ceremony, but he politely declined. He didn't want applause. He didn't want his face on flyers. Instead, he sat in the back, Scout at his side, listening to others speak. A few former officers stood and shared stories about their own dogs, their own failures to act. For the first time, Rourke realized he wasn't the only one carrying ghosts. He spent more time with people he used to avoid. Neighbors, veterans, even the young officers at the station who once seemed too green to take seriously. They came to him now not just for advice but for perspective. "You saw it early," one said, "but nobody was ready to hear it." Rourke shook his head. "That's the lie we tell ourselves," he replied. "Truth doesn't wait for permission. We just learn to stop looking away." One afternoon, he received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Rex, sitting proudly, tongue out, badge on his collar. On the back, in faded handwriting, "He was never broken, only too loyal to the wrong people." Rourke held the photo in both hands, the weight of it anchoring him to something he hadn't touched in years. Forgiveness. Not for Cole, but for himself. Scout seemed to sense the shift. That night, he didn't curl up at the foot of the bed like usual. He jumped up beside Rourke, rested his head on the man's chest, and let out a deep, steady breath. For the first time in over a decade, Rourke fell asleep without waking once. The nightmares were fewer now, and when they came, they no longer left him shaking. They came as memories, honest, painful, but somehow less cruel. He welcomed them, because with them came clarity. He had spent so long surviving, but now he was finally beginning to live again. He still wore his badge on occasion, not as a symbol of law, but as a reminder of duty, of watching closer, of never looking away again. He was no longer chasing justice. He was carrying it quietly in the form of 4 names, and the one that started it all. 6 months had passed since that foggy morning on Route 51, but Rourke still remembered it with crystal clarity. Not because of the cruelty he had witnessed, but because of what it had awakened in him. The silence he once feared had become a companion, one filled not with regret, but with meaning. He no longer saw himself as the man who missed the signs. He saw himself as the one who finally chose to act. Scout had become more than a dog. He was Rourke's shadow, his reminder, his redemption. The crooked paw didn't slow him down. If anything, it made him stand out. People at the shelter often smiled when they saw the two of them arrive together. Rourke never wore his badge, but everyone knew who he was. The man who didn't look away. The man who gave 4 forgotten lives a second chance, and, in the process, reclaimed his own. He spent more time at the shelter now, training others, listening to stories, helping where he could. He avoided attention, but the impact he left behind was unmistakable. A plaque with the name Scout, Ranger, Shadow, Buddy now hung on the back fence. People would stop, read, sit in silence. Some cried. Others simply stood there, as if the names alone said enough. It wasn't just about dogs. It was about the power of being seen, of not being discarded. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple, Rourke sat on his porch with Scout at his side. He held the old photo of Rex in his hands, now softened and faded with time. "We got partner," he whispered. The wind was gentle, the world quiet. Not the silence of pain, but the kind that comes after healing. A silence that holds peace, closure, and the promise of something better. When they went back inside, the porch light flickered behind them, and the door clicked shut. That house, once filled with shadows, now held warmth. And in that final, steady quiet, the kind he used to fear, Rourke finally understood. Real justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it comes in the form of 4 small paws and a second chance.